Good afternoon, and welcome to the Institute for Ethics in Government's first ever massively open online course. I'm very pleased to be with you today. My name is Patrick Shepard. I'm a lead instructor here at OGE, and I'm very happy to be joined today by of our two-session massively open online course. And we're very pleased about that because this is a course that we've taught many times in a classroom setting and in small groups here at OGE and also virtually. But today we were very pleased because we're going to have, almost 200 folks participating.
That's right.
Yeah, so we're very excited. Course that OGE's Institute for Ethics in Government has offered. And to give you a little bit of background, what we're going to be doing today is introducing an exercise. We're going to then give you a week to work on that exercise by yourself or with colleagues in your agency. And then next Monday, we're going to get together and start walking through the exercise. We're actually going to provide...
To get the exercise done, we do encourage vigorous, though friendly, competition amongst your offices.
Yeah. Before we get into the exercise itself, we'd like to share with you a few announcements. On Thursday, we will be offering our Advanced Practitioner Distance Learning event as usual. We'll be joined by Dan Scala from OGE's Compliance Division, and he will be discussing the new inspections process that they're rolling out and their early experiences with that program. Also, we want to remind you, if it's not already on your calendar, to join us next Monday at 2 for our debrief of this first ever massively open online course concerning outside activity prior approvals. And finally, next month, we are looking forward to offering you the distance learning events as usual, the Fundamental Series and the Advanced Practitioner Series. So, Ryan, what do you think? Should we get started with the slides, walk through the process, and introduce the exercise?
Let's go ahead and do that.
Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about is the advice and counseling process in general. When we talk about it, the outside activities approval process, what we're really doing is providing advice and counseling on the issues that might arise for an employee during their outside activity. They involve so much complexity. Do you know about how many authorities we're talking about when we're advising an employee on outside activities, Ryan?
Well, if we're talking about regular federal employees, not covered non-career employees or political appointees, we're talking about 17 different authorities that could be implicated when you look at the activity request.
And then if we have covered non-career employees, there's an additional layer of analysis that we have to make sure we engage in.
That's right.
Yeah, so it's a tricky place, the outside activities, and I think the hardest part is remembering to remember all of the authorities, to advise our employees completely.
So what you're saying, Patrick, is that oftentimes where we trip up in our practice analyze something.
Yeah, I find that when we see mistakes in guidance on outside activities, it's not that we've thought about the issue, we've looked up the law or regulation and applied it incorrectly. It's normally that we've failed to see an issue or anticipate a potential problem or failed to consider a particular authority. So that's kind of a tricky thing. It's a difficulty that we all face, and in the course of this program, what we'd really like to do is share with you some tools that are going to be really helpful to make sure that your advice and counseling with respect to outside activities is thorough and complete.
And we will make sure to point out when we get to the tools that are in the IEG store, we will remind you that you can go there and download them.
Yes. Yes, I think all of the materials will be in the IEG store if they're not. They're also available on the MAX course page, which you can find under courses and curricula.
That's right.
I'd encourage everyone to print those materials out and have them available to yourselves when you are engaged in the exercise, when you're practicing the exercise. You can also use them when you're advising employees at your own agencies. These are materials we've adopted from others we've seen at agencies that we thought were particularly effective. So when we're talking about outside activities, I mentioned we're talking about advice and counseling. And so you should be able to see on your screen right now a slide that indicates the advice and counseling. And I noticed this, Ryan, that this process isn't numbered. Why didn't we number the steps in the advice and counseling process?
Well, the reason why is because oftentimes And I'm sure that many of you have found this in your own practice. Oftentimes, when you start to go through the advice and counseling process, you need to go around the wheel more than once, so to speak. It's a circular process, not a teleological one.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to remember. I've never had an employee come into my office or even talk to an agency ethics official where I had all of the facts that I needed to thoroughly and completely understand the fact pattern and advise. So when we go through the advice and counseling process, we want you to keep employees aren't going to show up at your door and say, here's a perfectly formed fact pattern with everything you could possibly need in order to advise properly.
I believe that is what we call a magical unicorn.
So what are the steps here, Ryan? What do we need to know in order to provide advice and counseling on outside activities?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to know is we need to know the rules. We need to know the universe of potential statutes and regulations that could be implicated when we do an outside activity request, which, as we said earlier, there were how many?
17.
17.
And another layer if we're talking about senior folks.
That's right. So that's an awful lot of things that we need to know, or at least know that are out there.
That summarizes all of those authorities. We're going to look at that in detail in just a minute, but that's something that can help you be aware of the rules that might be implicated when you're talking about outside activities.
So what's the next part of our process, Patrick?
Well, the next thing you need to do is be able to spot the issues, and this is one of the things that I think we really want to help you get better at over the course of this massively open online course. This is something that usually only comes with experience. To be able to see the possible issues that weren't presented immediately, to infer from a fact pattern or a suggestion that maybe there's an issue here. And this is something you're going to be doing throughout the process. I don't know how many times I thought I was finished advising an employee. You ask that one final question and say, you wouldn't happen to be doing this thing, would you? And they say, oh yeah, would that be a problem? I didn't even know that was an ethics issue. And then you kind of have to circle around and start over. So the spotting of the issues is really hard and comes with experience, which we hope to provide you over the next week. What's the next one we're looking at, Ryan?
The next one is another experiential thing that it takes a lot of practice to get real good at, and that's to get the facts. You need to know for employees when you're going to provide advice and counsel to them in order to get all of the relevant facts out so that you can then apply them to the rules.
Yeah, when we look at that table of applicable authorities, we've provided you some suggested questions. And those questions can help you make sure that you get the facts you need to either determine affirmatively that an authority isn't going to pose a problem, or to identify the potential problem and advise properly on it. I think this is one of those tricky places with outside activities. You're rarely going to get to a place where you say absolutely yes or absolutely no with respect to someone's proposed outside activity. Normally the answer is yes, you can probably do that, but there are these 13 or 14 things that you have to be mindful of. But in order to make that determination and conduct that analysis, we're first going to have to get the facts.
That's right.
And finally, what's not the last step, but the final step in our circular process, Ryan?
So well, I would say the next step, because often you're going to spin around the wheel again. But you take the facts that you have, and then you apply the rules to that set of facts. And all that we're saying with this is after you've gathered all of your information, you're going to go back to the authority, and you're going to read it, and you're going to take the facts and see whether or not that authority is implicated or not.
Yes, and I think when we're talking about prior approval for outside activities or advising generally on outside activities, so it's very much like doing new entrant financial disclosure, where what we're trying to do is anticipate and see the potential issues and issue words of caution to the employee about when they need to seek advice in specific instances. So that's going to be an interesting way that we'll have to apply the rules to the facts, but much of what we're going to be doing is issue raising. Another thing we really encourage you to do when you're engaged in this process, while we've provided you the table of applicable authorities that can help you to spot issues, when you get into actual analysis and applying the law or regulation to a fact pattern, we encourage you to every single time look at the text of the law, look at the text of the regulation, break out your laws and regulations, and read to your analysis.
And one of the things that you'll find very helpful, and we'll go over this, is we have a job aid that does force march you through all of the authorities. And the thing that's nice about that is not only are you going to be not only are you going to be applying the rules and facts to all of those after reading them, but if you do go force march through that, then you're not going to miss anything, which is very, very important. As we've said before, one of the main problems is when people forget to consider an authority. So once we get to that, we're going to point that out, and like we said, it's in the IEG store. You can print that out and use it every time if you want.
Yeah. So should we take a look at our next step here, Ryan?
Yeah, let's do that.
So here we're going to jump into the tools that we have available for this this particular class, and that's the table of applicable authorities. I'm actually going to pull up the full screen version of it for us here, and hopefully you'll find this to be very helpful. I know I use it almost like a checklist when I'm providing advice on outside activities, because sometimes you say, no, this doesn't seem like an activity that would raise that particular issue. But then when you really sit down and think about it, make yourself consider it, you will find that there is actual, you'll be surprised frequently. So we go through these in order.
In the middle column, you'll see a summary of what the authority says. Don't use that as a basis of your advice and counsel. Use the actual language of the authority, because this is a summary of it, which, it's there so that, you kind of get yourself in the mindset of thinking about it. Go back to the actual authority.
Yes, please don't drop a footnote to our handy handout.
Yes.
So should we take a look at these authorities? We can just briefly talk about what each covers and some of the key questions that we might be thinking about, some scenarios in which we might see them, so that people are kind of familiar, if they're new to the practice, when they get into the exercise. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that, Patrick. All right, so our first one is 18 U.S.C. Section 203. So, Ryan, what is Section 203 bar in a few sentences? So Section 203 bars the receipt of compensation for representational services back to the government. So I can't get paid for representing an outside client or other person back before the government. That's right. And where do you think we often find this, Patrick? I imagine we probably find Section 203 outside activity problems with people who maybe practice law outside of the government, particularly for firms with federal practices, maybe people who are engaged in other kinds of advocacy work before the government. Do we have compensation there? Will it be in consideration for any representation before an agency or court of the U.S.? And that's sharing compensation. The employee doesn't actually have to provide the services personally. They're prohibited from sharing in compensation derived from representational services, even if those are rendered by another. So 203 is tricky, but we do find that in just that sort of small subset of outside activities where you're having someone work in a place that provides representational services to clients or others. That's right. Should we move on to 205? Yeah, let's take a look at 205. What is 205 bar? So 205 is also a representational bar, but this is without respect to compensation. And it's also a personal bar, so it prohibits federal employees from representing other persons before the government for compensation or not for compensation. It can be uncompensated representational services. That sounds awfully broad. Yeah, it is quite broad, and we find that this is the government, not just the agency the employee works for. And a lot of folks find that to be very surprising, that you can contravene Section 205, making a representation before a government agency that is not one that you're employed by. So we work at OGE. If we were to represent others before, let's say the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Department of the Treasury or USDA, all of that might be prohibited by Section 205. Now, one thing that I would like to remind folks is that there are some exceptions within 205 that it is useful to always review when you're looking at outside activity requests, because sometimes those will be captured in there. Yeah, and I think this is one of those places that employees aren't very sensitive about and can inadvertently contravene quite easily. Mm-hmm. So I think you always want to caution employees about 205, regardless of what kind of outside activity they're involved in. Yeah. Do you know why it's so broad, Ryan? Do you have a sense of that? Well, I know a little bit of history behind it. So do you know the law that was the predecessor to 205? Do you know after which war? I believe it was the Mexican-American War. That's right. And okay, so what happened that it started as some perceived misconduct by a member of Congress, if I recall correctly. He was representing clients before a commission after the war that was paying landowners for damages that they suffered as a result of the conflict.
Okay.
And I think if I remember correctly, what this individual was doing, he had some clients that he was representing before the commission who were handing out the compensation, and it turned out that the claim was fraudulent. And sort of weird accident of history, he had absolutely no idea that this was a fraudulent claim. He had just been retained to represent these folks. He assumed that it was a legitimate claim, but it turned out to be fraudulent, and it became quite controversial at the time. And so the Congress decided that no one will represent anyone else before agencies of the United States government.
So that's a good example of a bad egg just ruining it for everyone.
Yes, and the law of ethics rules is we usually get more, not less.
Yeah.
So 205 is probably with us for the foreseeable future, and it's an important one to be aware of. It's also helpful to understand the breadth of it if you know a little bit about the history. So let's take a look at the next authority, and this is sort of the granddaddy of all the authorities. This is the one that we're looking at often with financial disclosure, with financial conflicts of interest. So could you tell us about Section 208 briefly, Ryan?
Sure. Section 208 is a bar on acting in matters that are affecting a financial interest. And when we say financial interest, we're talking about an employee's financial interest and a small universe of other individuals and entities whose interests are imputed to that employee.
And I think that's where it's really important with respect to outside activities, because that list includes the spouse and minor child, which is important. But more importantly, it includes any organization where the employee serves as officer, director, trustee, general partner, or employee. So if we have an employment kind of outside activity, we're going to impute the financial interests of that organization in whole to the employee.
Which, if you have an organization like, say, it's General Electric,
and our employees, yes, that
is a gigantic universe of other entities that could be pulled into that.
Yeah, so this might be the first time that you're seeing this particular financial interest with respect to Section 208, and you want to be particularly mindful of that. This is also the area where if we're going to deny someone outside activity or deny them approval, we can order them to resign if their participation in that outside activity causes them to have to recuse so frequently that it materially affects their ability to do their government jobs. So that's another good thing to keep in mind. I think this is one that everyone's, because it's really important. So I want to be on the lookout for that when you get to the exercise.
That's right.
Let's take a look at Section 209.
So what is tell me about 209, Patrick.
So the basic idea with 209 is that the federal government should pay federal employees for doing their federal work, and no one else should. So if you have a situation where it appears that an employee is being paid to do their federal job by an outside organization, or where a federal employee is receiving something that has been increased in value or quantity because of their government position, we may have considerations under Section 209. So anytime you're dealing with compensation with respect to an outside activity, you want to be mindful of Section 209 and make sure that the employee isn't receiving compensation for an outside organization because of their federal position. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense.
Yeah, so this is just something to consider. We have some questions here. First question we want to ask is the employee being compensated? Is this truly an outside activity, not an official duty? So like if someone on the outside were paying you and I to deliver this course right now, we might have a problem under Section 209.
That's right.
So that's the kind of question we want to ask. As a factual matter, no one except the Office of Government Ethics is compensating Ryan or I for being here today. We also want to see if there are any benefits being offered, and we want to find out if those benefits are customary or are they specific or contingent upon government service.
Mm-hmm.
The answer to that question is yes. If they're contingent on government service, we may have some thinking to do about Section 209.
That's right.
So that covers the criminal conflict of interest statutes.
So now let's go ahead and talk about the regulatory restrictions,
which are numerous.
There are many of them, yeah. So this first one, let's talk about gifts from outside sources just real briefly. So what's the prohibition on gifts from outside sources, Patrick?
So generally, are given by prohibited sources. So those are people who do or seek to do business with the agency, folks that are regulated by the agency, folks that are affected by the performance or non-performance of our official duties. So we can't accept gifts from those under the general prohibition. But we do have some exceptions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we do have a number of exceptions. And why do we care about this with respect to outside activities? Why is this going to be a concern?
Well, I think the reason why is because sometimes it can be kind of confusing whether or not the compensation that someone is receiving for an outside activity is in fact compensation or whether it is a separate gift entirely.
Yeah, and I think often, when you have an outside relationship or outside business involvement, there are sometimes gratuities that are associated with that. Maybe you're in the sales area and there's some reward trips. Maybe there are just gratuities that are provided by clients or others. So we just want to be aware of that, make employees aware that if they're receiving a gratuity that's associated with their outside activity, that we need to consider that under the gifts rules and make sure that an exception applies.
That's right.
So that's something to keep in mind. And if you can foresee possibilities or areas where a gift issue might come up, it's good to alert employees to that when you're considering their outside activity.
Yeah, because then you can tell them that they need to come and talk to you to have a gifts analysis done and see whether or not it's acceptable for them to accept that gift.
We come to impartiality, performing official duties. So this is subpart E of the Standards of Conduct. We find it at 5 CFR 2635-502. When are we concerned with the impartiality provisions, Ryan?
Which a reasonable person with access to the relevant facts might question an employee's impartiality.
Could you say that again backwards?
I cannot.
So we're really concerned here with someone having a covered relationship, maybe as a result of an outside activity. This is in addition to Section 208. So if they're an employee, officer, director, trustee, or general partner, we're going to want to look at the criminal statute first. And in fact, that's why these authorities are in this order. Right. We always want to consider the criminal provisions first. But say we had an outside activity that doesn't raise to the level of employee. Someone's a contractor, they have clients. Will we have a covered relationship under subpart E then?
We definitely would.
Yeah, so we want to be mindful of that because an outside activity, even if it doesn't impute an interest under 208, might create a covered relationship under 502.
And someone with access to the relevant facts could then question that employee's impartiality.
We want to anticipate that and make sure our agencies aren't criticized.
Right.
The other thing we want to think about here, there's another sort of sneaky provision in 502. Because we have a covered relationship with someone for a year after something happened.
Served in as the various ones that you've enumerated already: officer, employee, director, trustee,
consultant,
agent, general partner, any sort of business relationship like that. Someone's going to have a covered relationship for a whole year after they're done doing that.
Yeah, so this is kind of a weird thing to be addressing right at the front end, but it's a good thing to be aware of, that an employee might have an outside activity that takes place over a constrained period of time, but they're going to have that covered relationship with their former employer for 1 year after the termination of that arrangement. And
it's also good. So it's also good to make the employee aware of that on the front end, because it wouldn't be fair to then tell them later on, oh yeah, by the way.
And also there's this.
Yes, you also have to continue to recuse for another year. So it's good to get that out front and say, okay, as soon as you're done with this outside activity, you're going to have a whole year after that you're not going to be able to work on particular matters involving specific parties in which that outside entity is or represents a party.
Yeah, and I think our exercise is a really fun one here because we're going to have a lot of opportunity to see some permutations in ways that the conflict of interest statute at Section 208 can interact with Subpart E of the standards. So that's going to be fun when we get there. But be on the lookout for that as you work through the exercise, because there's going to be some important stuff there.
That's right.
That brings us to the next section. This is a subpart G of the standards, which deals with misuse of position, sort of a perennial concern when people have outside business activities while they're federal employees. So what kind of things do you make sure to counsel people about here, Ryan?
So I always make sure to counsel people when we're talking about outside activities. I make sure to counsel them not to use their official time on anything related to that outside position, not to use official equipment, not to use anybody else's time.
Yes.
Also, not to use their position in order to get that outside position,
or advance the interests of other parties outside of the government.
That's right, and I also am very careful to make sure that I counsel people that they do not use non-public information.
Yeah, I think that's a very important one. So this will become sort of boilerplate to you after you've done a few of these, but we always kind of have the same concerns. We want to make sure that or whole use for government purposes and are not put to bear or put to use on behalf of an outside employer or other business entity. We have a reference here to 802, 2635 802, and I think this is an important place for us to be aware of when we're talking about outside activities. What does this do for us, Ryan?
So what 802 gives us, it gives us the authority to say to someone who does have an outside affect their ability or impair their ability to do their government work, this gives us the authority to tell them you will resign.
Yeah, so if for some reason you have to decline a request for outside activity, or you have a new employee who's going to have to resign from an outside position, this is from where your authority comes, and it's important to be aware of that. And then we have some specific provisions. We have the provision 805 dealing with service as an expert witness. So if you have someone who proposes to be an expert witness, you want to make sure that you're aware that this is here and take a look at the specific provisions, and we provided you some questions. And this one, this final one, this penultimate one that we're going to discuss deals with teaching, speaking, and writing, and we're going to take a really close look at this in the context of our exercise because our employee is proposing to teach a class.
That's right. It's going to be good.
Yeah, and these are some interesting provisions that deal with compensation for teaching, speaking, or writing that relates to official duties. And there are lots of sort of nuances and areas where surprises are hiding from us in this provision. And we're going to make sure that we have occasion to take a deep look at all of those next Monday. But what I'd encourage you to do, and think about how you would advise our employee on the teaching, speaking, and writing provisions.
And we've got one last authority, just to make you aware of. If you have an employee who's talking about engaging in fundraising activities, you're going to want to take a look at 808 to make sure that you can give them the right perspective advice as to what sorts of things they can do while they're engaged in fundraising activity.
Yeah, and I think on Monday we're going to be talking about a scenario involving teaching, speaking, and writing, where a number of other authorities are going to come up. But we have other scenarios. So if there's a lot of interest and this goes well, perhaps we could later take on a provision that dealt with some fundraising provisions. We could take a look at those in a later massively open online course. Presidential appointees and other non-career employees. We just want you to be aware of those. Our employee, for the purpose of the exercise, is a career official, but we must remember these in the event that we're advising a presidential appointee or other non-career official. And I find that these are difficult to remember because they don't come up that often.
That's right, and that's why we included them on the document, so that if you do print this out and use this at your agency, you'll be able to you'll remember to flip through the whole thing and make sure that you've covered the entire waterfront.
Yep. So this is another case where we want to make sure that we don't have any errors of omission. That we make sure to consider all of the applicable and relevant authorities.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the exercise. Let's provide.
We've got here, the next thing that you should see coming up on your screen is an agency profile. And the reason why we have made up an agency for purposes of doing this exercise is because if we use someone else's agency, they would say, hey, you're picking on me. So,
and we probably get the facts all wrong.
We probably would too. So with this one, we're able to totally control the facts, and we have an agency called the Electrical Utility Agency. And just take a minute and read what's on the slide about the missions, supplemental regulations, and prohibited holding statutes.
Yeah, so as we're practicing as ethics officials at the Electrical Utility Agency, these are facts that you're going to want to put it on your desk, so you can think about what kind of issues might pose potential conflicts of interest, where we might have concerns with outside organizations, things like that. We've tried to design this exercise in such a way that no matter where you work, it's a familiar scenario. It's not extremely specialized to a particular agency. We want this to be as broadly applicable and interesting as possible, while still raising interesting issues that help us learn about the laws and regulations. So be mindful of the agency profile. We also want to take you through the request for outside activity approval. So as you may have noted, at EUA we have a supplemental regulation that requires prior approval for outside activities. And corresponding to that, we have a form that requests information so that we can provide a determination about approval or disapproval of the outside activity.
And for those of you who do have a supplemental regulation that requires prior approval for outside activity and have a form for it, this may look kind of familiar because we stole from you.
Yes. So we have this, and this is going to provide the majority of the facts you need to conduct your analysis. So I'd encourage you to use a highlighter or a pen and make notes of facts that I think are going to be important as we go through the area. So be aware that that's there, and in conjunction with the agency profile, you should be able to take a good crack at an analysis.
This is what was one of the things we said about getting the facts earlier, Patrick, in our wheel?
We often need to do that, and Mr. Faraday, our fictional employee, has been non-responsive recently. I've not been able to get in contact with him on the telephone. He doesn't respond to his emails. I think it may be because he's a made-up person.
That is true. So this person doesn't bear any resemblance to anybody that we actually know.
Yeah.
Or to any real person for that matter.
So as you're going through the exercise, where you find areas where you don't have sufficient facts, note that. We'll show you the form in just a minute that you'll complete. If there's a fact that you need or a question you want to ask, make note of those questions, and we're going to talk about those thorough determinations. So if there's an area we don't have facts enough to determine that an authority either definitely poses a problem or is definitely not a problem, note the information that you would need to make that determination. So we're not going to get all the way there next Monday. We're going to go through each of the authorities once and think about how we would conduct the analysis. And finally, we have for you the outside activities analysis sheet. And feel free to use this whenever you want.
Right. This is in the IAG store. A blank one is in the IAG store. This one has got a name of our employee and his position on there. The thing is let's go ahead and scroll down on this, Patrick.
Sure. There's some comments. Yeah, let's take a look at the first authority here.
Yeah, so what we've got here, the way this thing works is you have this applicable authority. So 18 U.S.C. 203 is the first one, and we have what we'd like you to do is to take the facts and do an analysis on those facts and see whether or not 203 is going to maybe apply, whether it might be a risk, or whether it is not likely to be an issue at all. And if you can't quite get there, if you can't quite get to an answer on any of questions would you ask to develop the facts?
Yeah, or if any facts cause you some concerns but you can't make a complete analysis, make note of those things. So as you're going through the exercise, for each authority, we want you to determine whether it's definitely an issue, it's going to be a showstopper, we can't move forward, whether it's a risk that we have to advise the employee on, or if it's just not likely to be an issue and we don't need to mention it. I'll give you a hint. Most cases, we're going to find that things are a risk. It's a rare day that we find that something is absolutely a showstopper. Normally it's, this is a concern, it might be difficult to manage, but it is manageable. So keep that in mind as you go through the exercises.
One other thing is that if you do find something that will be a risk, go ahead and take a minute and
I want to talk a little bit about the management, the nuts and bolts of running a counseling program with respect to outside activities before we sign off. And we've put here an excerpt from 2635-803, which deals with prior approval for outside employment and activities. And in order to require prior approval, you need a supplemental regulation. And those have to be concurred on with OGE. So if you have one, that's a great tool in your arsenal of helping to advise employees. Because as you mentioned, there are 17 authorities that apply to everyone, and another universe for our more senior folks.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of potential problems for an employee or an individual. So it's always going to be good to get advice and counseling. So if you give you an opportunity to advise them.
Well, if we don't have a prior approval supplemental regulation, Patrick,
yeah.
Can we still require through policy that people get prior approval?
We cannot. We can strongly suggest that people get prior approval, and one of the best ways to do that is through your training or advice and counseling programs. Make people aware that this is an area with a great deal of risk, both personally and to the organization, and that you want to be able to have the opportunity to advise them appropriately. But in terms of putting in place, an actual requirement that's mandatory for all employees, you really need the supplemental regulation.
And if you're interested in exploring that possibility, if you don't have that supplemental, want to think about and get you started on the process if that's what you really want.
Yeah, no, and that's absolutely appropriate for many agencies. And again, with so many possible authorities that could pose so many different problems, this is a place where you really don't want your employees giving themselves sort of DIY ethics advice.
Now, one thing that you did that you mentioned was the financial disclosures, Patrick.
Yes.
Oftentimes, we like to think of financial disclosures as a request for advice.
Yes.
And there's a whole section just for outside activities on there. And when you see something that's on there that you want to know about, go ahead and feel free to call your employee up and ask them for more information about that outside activity so that you can then right on the spot access in place so that you can then provide better advice and counsel later.
Yeah, so anytime you see a new outside activity on a 450 or a 278, make a note of that and make sure that your employees are aware that you're concerned about it and provide them advice as necessary or as appropriate. That's without respect to whether or not you have a supplemental regulation. If you become aware of it through financial disclosure, you should advise on it before certifying the report or concurrently with the certification process.
Mm-hmm. Now, so as we mentioned earlier, we now have an exercise that we would like you to do.
Yeah, so we're going to give you guys a week. We'll see you next Monday at 2 o'clock, same time, same place. If you'd like to work with other folks in your office, we strongly encourage that. I think this is a really fun exercise to do in groups if you have a number of folks that you work with. If you don't, you can definitely do it by yourself. And then next week we're going to come together and we're going to go through literally one at a time. We're going to start with Section 203. We're going to go all the way to the end of the standards. We're going to talk about whether or not we have a problem that we might foresee.
And then after that, we're going to open it up for any questions that you might have or any anecdotes or stories about when you were going through it to find out what you thought about it and to answer any questions or anything that needs clarification from you.
Yeah, so with that, we'd like to turn you loose to start the exercise. And we'll also open it up to questions if you have any questions about the instructions or what you're supposed to be doing next or how we get together next week. Sylvia, we'd like to open it up for questions if you have a moment.
Thank you. If you'd like to ask a question, press *1 on your phone. Just remember to unmute your phone and record your name clearly when prompted. Once again, if you have a question, press *1. And Mr. Shepard, it appears that we have no questions at this time.
Excellent, thank you. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions. If you run into an issue as you're going through the exercise, please feel free to reach out to us. You can email us through the IAG page on Max. You can talk to your colleagues or look forward to talking to you next week at 2 o'clock, where we're going to go through the exercise. It'll probably run at least 2 hours.
At least 2 hours, yeah, because we're going to hit all of those authorities that are listed on there, and we're going to break it down and get into some nitty-gritty on all of them.
Yeah, so thank you very much for joining us. If you had some colleagues who missed today's presentation, please feel free to share the link with them. They can watch that during the next week and then be prepared for next week's.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention today, and we look forward to hearing from you next week.
Great. Thank you, guys.